Have you ever wondered how far desperation can drive a person, and if in trying to solve a problem, someone could create a curse that would spread for generations? What Lot's daughters did is more shocking than many imagine, and the consequences, well, they were even worse. Imagine the city you call home being destroyed by fire and brimstone. People running, screams echoing, the sky in flames. And when it all ends, only silence remains. Lot and his 2 daughters are the only survivors, taking refuge in a dark cave, surrounded by mountains and the weight of the past. They face the emptiness of isolation. It is there, in that suffocating environment, where an unimaginable plan is born. A sin that surpasses moral limits. But why did they do that? Would they have had other options? And most importantly, what does this story have to do with you? Don't think this is just an ancient and distant tale. The decisions made in that cave produced bitter fruits that echoed for centuries and can serve as a warning for the choices you make today. Get ready. This story will surprise you and perhaps make you reconsider your own attitudes. To understand how Lot's daughters came to make such a drastic decision, it's essential to go back a bit in time and understand the context of this story. Lot was Abraham's nephew, a righteous man who received God's promise of a great descent. By his own choice, Lot separated from Abraham and established his dwelling in the fertile plains near Sodom. A decision motivated by the prosperous appearance of the region, but which ignored the moral corruption of that people. That seemingly innocent choice was the first step towards a tragic destiny. Sodom and Gomorrah were mired in serious sins. The wickedness was such that God decided to destroy the cities as an act of justice. Even so, out of love for Abraham and mercy for Lot, 2 angels were sent to alert them. Even in the face of urgency, Lot hesitated, a reflection of how sin can tie us to destructive environments and habits. It's a warning. How many times do we know what must be done, but hesitate to act? With destruction imminent, Lot hastily fled with his wife and daughters. During the escape, a shocking detail reveals human nature. Lot's wife, disobeying the divine order, looked back and was transformed into a pillar of salt. The loss was devastating, and Lot was now a widower with 2 traumatized daughters and a shattered life. Refugees in a cave, surrounded by rubble and the disturbing silence of destruction, Lot and his daughters faced the most absolute loneliness. With no news from the outside world, the young women believed that all of humanity had been annihilated. Fear and desperation became their only companions. It is in this environment of isolation and uncertainty where the distortion of reality is born, and with it, an unimaginable decision. How many times has fear distorted your perception of reality? To what extent can emotions lead us to do what we never imagined? This is the scenario before the moral fall, and what follows is even more surprising. Driven by desperation and the belief that they were the last survivors, Lot's daughters devised an alarming plan: to intoxicate their father and lie with him to ensure descendants. Genesis chapter 19 verse 31 says, "Then the older daughter said to the younger, 'Our father is old, and there is no man on earth to unite with us, as is the custom throughout the earth.'" The justification seemed logical given the situation, but it revealed the distortion caused by fear and impatience. For them, the tragedy they had witnessed was a hopeless end, and the easiest solution was to resort to the unacceptable. The first night, they gave Lot wine until he lost consciousness. The older one lay with him. The next day, they repeated the act with the younger daughter. Lot, who at other times was considered righteous, became the centerpiece of a shameful story. Although unconscious, his drunkenness evidences negligence and lack of vigilance. How many tragedies could have been avoided if we had been attentive to the dangers around us? Allowing oneself to lose control, whether through drink or any other vice, opens space for irreversible situations. The error committed there was not only moral, it was spiritual. Lot's daughters acted based on scarcity and haste, ignoring God's sovereignty. There are those who still today justify wrong choices with the phrase, "It was the only way out," but desperation should never be a counselor. Genesis shows how thoughtless actions, even if understandable in the context of fear, can generate bitter consequences. The young women were so consumed by anguish that they forgot about the God who had just saved their lives from the destruction of Sodom. Where was the trust in the one who had demonstrated absolute power? This forgetfulness is dangerous. When fear becomes greater than faith, unthinkable decisions seem acceptable. Moreover, the plan was executed in stages, showing premeditation. They could have reconsidered after the first night, but the insistence on error demonstrates how much the mind can be blinded by a false urgency. And Lot, despite being drunk, his role cannot be ignored. The Bible condemns drunkenness precisely because of the dangers it brings. Lot not only put himself in a vulnerable position but failed to protect his own daughters from the influence of the surrounding environment. If before he chose to live near Sodom and suffered the consequences, now he allowed another error due to lack of vigilance over himself. The result of that decision: 2 pregnancies that gave rise to Moab and Ben-Ami, ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites, peoples who throughout history became constant enemies of Israel. What was born in a dark cave reverberated in conflicts that spanned generations. The most tragic thing is that the act committed in hiding did not remain hidden from God or from history. When we try to solve problems in a sinful way, the fruits of that decision often surpass what we imagine. The story could have followed another path if trust in God's timing had prevailed. This episode is not recorded in the scriptures by chance. It serves as a warning against hasty decisions and solutions motivated by fear. There are times when waiting seems unbearable, but rushing can be even more disastrous. And this applies to all areas of life. How many enter into wrong relationships for fear of being alone? How many make irresponsible financial decisions out of panic in the face of scarcity? The Genesis narrative reveals a simple and profound truth. Haste in solving a problem can create many others, even worse ones. Even so, there is an aspect that cannot be ignored. God allowed the story to be recorded with all its details, not to expose Lot and his daughters to scorn, but to teach us. Human beings fail, but the Word of God remains as a guide. How many times do stories like this show us that wrong decisions motivated by fear and lack of faith are traps disguised as solutions? The best path is always to seek divine direction before acting. When God is consulted, He shows alternatives that our anxious eyes fail to see. The consequences of the act of Lot's daughters were not limited to the moment of conception. What seemed like an immediate solution generated historical and spiritual implications that spanned generations. Genesis chapter 19 verse 37-38 says, "The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day." Thus were born 2 nations that, instead of representing continuity and blessing, became a source of constant conflict for the people of Israel. The Moabites and Ammonites settled near Israel, however, geographical proximity never translated into harmony. On the contrary, the history between these peoples was marked by rivalry, distrust, and wars. In Numbers 22, Balak, king of Moab, fearing the advance and prosperity of Israel in the desert, hired Balaam to curse the chosen people. The attempt failed because God turned the curse into a blessing, but the episode revealed the hostility of the Moabites. Years later, the Ammonites also demonstrated aggressive opposition, attacking Israel in the period of the Judges. In the times of Kings Saul and David, they were involved in direct confrontations. The root of these conflicts can be traced back to that dark night in the cave, an act committed in hiding but whose echoes spanned centuries. However, the problem was not limited to military issues. The spiritual impact of these nations on Israel was even more devastating. The Moabites and Ammonites followed pagan gods like Chemosh and Molech, deities whose cults involved repulsive practices, including human sacrifices, especially of children. The worship of these gods was not just idolatry, it was a profound corruption of moral values. When Israel gave in to the influence of these cultures, it was dragged towards practices that deeply displeased the Lord. The sin committed in secret by 2 women in a desperate attempt to preserve a lineage ended up becoming a dangerous spiritual snare that entangled entire generations. The book of Judges chapter 10 verse 6 relates that, "The children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths, the gods of Syria, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the people of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines." This religious mixture was not just a spiritual affront but brought practical consequences: military defeats, internal crises, and periods of slavery. The seduction of the Moabites and Ammonites did not occur only on battlefields, but also at parties, mixed marriages, and political alliances that undermined the fidelity of God's people. Despite this scenario loaded with hostility and idolatry, the biblical story is not composed only of judgment. It also exalts grace and redemption. From the lineage of Moab emerged Ruth, a Moabite who decided to break with the pagan gods and follow the God of Israel. Her declaration to Naomi in Ruth chapter 1 verse 16 is one of the most beautiful expressions of loyalty and faith. "Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth was not only welcomed among the Israelites but also married Boaz, becoming the great-grandmother of King David and therefore part of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, as recorded in Matthew chapter 1 verse 5. This detail reveals a fundamental trait of God's character. Even from a tainted origin and a reprehensible act, He can extract redemption and purpose. Thus, the cursed destiny of Lot's daughters was not just a family or local matter. It was a turning point in the history of Israel, with implications that transcended borders and centuries. And even with God's redemptive intervention, the narrative remains as a warning. Decisions made in darkness, without the light of divine wisdom, can cast shadows too long to be ignored. Now the question arises: what can this story teach us today? The story of Lot's daughters goes beyond an ancient tale. It exposes timeless human dilemmas: fear, desperation, haste, and decisions made under pressure. How many times, in the face of a crisis, do we try to solve things on our own? Their error was thinking that urgency justified any attitude without considering the consequences. And you, have you trusted in God's timing, or have you given in to haste? In moments of uncertainty, it's common to seek quick solutions, but shortcuts can be costly. Just as Lot's daughters rushed, many today enter toxic relationships out of fear of loneliness, make imprudent financial decisions, or act on impulse. Genesis shows that impatience can generate bitter fruits. Trusting God requires waiting, even when waiting seems unbearable. Another important point is the influence of emotions on choices. Fear, when not controlled, distorts reality. Lot's daughters, isolated and frightened, lost the perspective that God could provide another way. This happens when we let anxiety guide our decisions. In these moments, it's crucial to remember God's promises and seek wisdom in prayer. The human solution may seem logical, but it's not always correct. It's also necessary to consider generational consequences. Our choices today can impact our children, grandchildren, and even people we can't imagine. So before acting, ask yourself, does this decision honor God? What legacy am I building? However, there is hope even when we err. The story of Ruth, a descendant of the Moabites, shows that God specializes in turning tragedies into purposes. If you have already made wrong decisions, don't despair. Sincere repentance and seeking God can redirect your story. The past doesn't need to define your future. But if you're still facing a decision, choose wisely to not reap fruits of pain tomorrow. Moreover, this story reminds us of a vital principle in times of crisis. Before acting, stop, pray, reflect, trust. Not everything that seems urgent needs to be resolved immediately. God sees beyond what we see. When we wait on Him, we avoid traps that haste tends to set. The story of Lot's daughters serves as a warning but also as an invitation to total dependence on God. May your decisions from now on be guided by faith, not fear. And if you've come this far, it's likely that this story has moved you. So don't leave unchanged. Reflect on the decisions you've made and on the legacy you're building. God doesn't expect perfection, but a heart willing to listen and obey. And if you've erred, don't fear. There is forgiveness for those who turn to Him sincerely. Now we want to hear from you. What have you learned from today's story? How will you apply it in your life? Let us know in the comments. Lastly, if this message spoke to you, share it with someone who needs that warning and that hope. Like and subscribe to the channel to receive new content. And remember, all your choices matter for today, for tomorrow, and for eternity.